Oh, now it's being recorded. How wonderful. Welcome everyone to the New Mexico State Power Dialog. Oh, we have a couple other videos coming in. Yeah, everyone has video access. I thought we took them away. So we'll keep an eye on those. Yeah, welcome. Thank you all for joining. We have Noah Long and Ying and Abraham all agreeing to be speakers this evening, and Dave Dubois here will be moderating. Hello. So we'll start off with a webinar from this is one of many webinars that will be taking place this evening, one in every state and some internationally. And it's all being hosted and coordinated by Bard College. So they've put together a video talking about it. Dave, are you able to show it, or do you want me to? We're all learning how to move into the future of all this Zoom. There we go. And if you have any questions throughout the webinar, please feel free to send them to that email address, ajenks@nmsu.edu, and we will do our best to ask all the questions that you have, and yeah, do that.
Okay, I'll go ahead and start the video now.
Beautiful, thank you very much.
Welcome to Solve Climate by 2030. Today, universities in almost all 50 U.S. states, Puerto Rico, D.C., and several other countries are hosting state and region-wide webinars focused on ambitious and feasible things that we can all do in our cities, our towns, and states in the coming year to really move the needle on climate change. Here is the most important idea to take home today. What you do locally will change the future. Fact, the U.S. state of Georgia is a top 10 solar state. The neighboring Sunshine State of Florida has very little solar power due to outdated laws and regulations. When we launched Solve Climate a year ago, we could never have imagined that today, entire countries and much of the world's economy would be shut down, with hundreds of thousands of people ill, thousands having passed away, and our health systems overwhelmed. I take that back. We could easily have imagined this. Our health experts and scientists warned us this was coming. After SARS and MERS, they told us this was coming, and yet we didn't take preventive action, we didn't prepare. COVID-19 has shown how fragile our health and economic systems are to extreme events. Our scientists have told us clearly that unchecked, climate change will turn our lives into an unending series of extreme events. Floods, droughts, rising sea levels, pests and disease, more extreme storms and hurricanes, all of this leaving hundreds of millions of people homeless and on the move. We can change this. We still have time to change that future. Last year, the world's top climate scientists told us that we have until 2030, 10 years now, to cut global warming pollution aggressively in order to stabilize the climate at the low end. That warning was the genesis for this national and international discussion today on how to solve climate by 2030. Solving climate in 10 years, that sounds challenging. And yet fixing the energy half of climate change by 2030 is looking more, not less likely than it was 4 years ago. The cost of solar and wind power, batteries, and electric vehicles have plummeted. In many cases, they are less expensive now than the fossil fuel power that causes global warming, and they are getting cheaper every day. Already, utility-scale wind and solar, big solar and wind farms that feed power into the grid, these technologies are crushing fossil fuels in much of the U.S. In Colorado, Idaho, and California, renewable bids are coming in at half the price that the cheapest fossil fuel plants can do. And this is where rooftop solar and battery systems are headed in the near future. On the vehicles front, all the major manufacturers see this coming. Mercedes-Benz announced last fall that they have designed their last gasoline-powered car. Going forward, every new model of theirs will be electric. Combining electric-powered vehicles with the impact of driverless technology, we could see a very rapid transition away from gasoline-based cars to EVs in the next decade. All this progress was the result of a major technology push by national governments. Starting in America in the 70s and then ramping up with the Danes, the British, the Japanese and Koreans, the Germans, and most recently the Chinese and Indians, government policies have brought these industries to scale. And now the market is taking over, and renewables, battery storage, and electric vehicles are on track to deliver power and transportation at prices unsubsidized that will lead to major disruptions of energy markets in the 2020s. Can we get there fast enough to solve climate? Well, this is where you come in. With plummeting prices for renewables and electric-powered transports, the pace of the clean energy revolution will no longer be determined by Washington, D.C. and other national governments. Instead, the core action is going to be in your city, at your electric utility, and in your state capital. The key to solving climate by 2030 will be clearing the path at the local level to rapid deployment of solar, wind, battery storage, and electric vehicles. We need to get rid of outmoded laws and regulations that are holding back the transition. Florida needs to take the lesson from Georgia. It's imperative that we have justice in this transition. We have to make sure that the millions of green jobs that are created are jobs for all, and that everyone has access to clean, affordable power and mobility. Today, in Nebraska and New Jersey, in Idaho and Alabama, in Bangladesh and Brazil, we're going to find out what are 3 ambitious but feasible things that we can do right at home to smooth the path for clean energy and to bring energy justice to our communities. Following the webinar, I hope you will join a group or class discussion about what you can do to make these solutions real. Then, what next? Well, this summer, young people in particular have a terrific opportunity to both support climate solutions and gain valuable job skills in a down economy. The most powerful thing you can do to solve climate by 2030 is to join the political campaign of a candidate who best represents your views on climate solutions. In doing that, you'll also learn how to communicate, you'll gain courage, and most importantly, be part of a creative, strong, powerful vision for the future. COVID-19 is giving us a stark lesson about what happens when we ignore warnings from science. Today, we'll see how 10 years can be enough time to drive the climate solutions that we need, and that the future will be what we make it. Thank you for the work you will do to solve climate.
So he mentioned breakout sessions that are recommended. That was a part of our original plan to have those breakout sessions, but of course now it's not exactly possible. But if you are a teacher or professor or anything like that who is interested in hosting a session such as that, there's a lot of material on the Solve Climate by 2030 website where you are able to access and lead that discussion. So from here, we'll move over to Noah to give his presentation. Are you there, Noah? Hopefully, maybe. Testing it out. Are you there? Or you want to take it away?
Can you all hear me? I'm going to share my screen if that's all right.
Yes, perfect.
Great. And can you see my screen?
Yeah, it's not in a present view, but we can at least see it. Yeah, there you go.
Okay, should be in now.
Beautiful.
Okay, well, good afternoon, and thanks for inviting me to this conversation. And obviously, this is a intense and stressful and difficult time for many of us. And I first start just by saying I hope everybody on the call is healthy and that you're all doing what you can in these difficult times to stay healthy and keep your families healthy, staying home and staying safe. And I also know these are incredibly difficult times for so many folks economically, with so many folks out of work. And so I just want to send my appreciation for everybody here and all of your families during these hard times, and my hopes for all of you as well. So my name is Noah Long. I'm an attorney with the Natural Resources Defense Council. I've worked with NRDC for a little over a decade, working on state level energy and climate policy. So I'll briefly talk through just what I think could be a meaningful policy for New Mexico to address climate change in the next 10 years. And in doing so, talk a little bit about just the sort of complex nature of climate and climate pollution in New Mexico, because it really does run through every sector of our economy. So as the speaker in the video noted, these times dealing with COVID-19 obviously makes everything more difficult, makes imagining taking on this crisis both all the more critical, but also certainly more difficult in a time when so much has come to a halt. And certainly New Mexico's economy will be quite different in the coming months and years than many of us had hoped or anticipated. I think it also notes, as he mentioned, just the urgency of all of our action on this. And there's unfortunately no rule or law out there that we only have one problem at a time. So climate change hasn't gone away, and the urgency to act is just as real, if not more urgent than ever before. The good news on that is I think that New Mexico and the world around us, we have the technology and we have seen many of the policies that can move the needle on climate change. So renewable energy, as mentioned by the speaker, is now the cheapest way to generate electricity across the United States, and certainly in the Southwest, where we have some of the best wind resources and solar resources in the country. And New Mexico is already demonstrating policy leadership, particularly on renewable energy, with one of the strongest renewable energy standards in the country, requiring at least 50% renewables by 2030 and full carbon-free electricity by 2045 statewide. Our state's largest utility is already committed to beating that standard, but to be carbon-free by 2040. Certainly we can and should go faster, but I think that kind of leadership across that sector demonstrates what we can do when we put our minds to it and we work together. We'll just need to build on that momentum, both in the electricity sector, but then also to replicate it across all of the sectors to get there. That leads me to the policy recommendation that I'll make for today, and that I hope we can work on together here in New Mexico, which is that we simply give the authority to the state to regulate carbon dioxide and other climate pollution emissions, and require them in doing so to meet science-based targets for emissions reductions over the coming years and decades. That would be a policy that would string across multiple agencies, and each agency would take care of, have a different role in each of the various major sectors. Certainly the Environment Department would play a lead, as would the Energy Department, but also departments like New Mexico's Department of Transportation would play a critical role. And I think if we do that, we can do what we need to do to begin the hard work to cut emissions from the sectors where we're seeing far less progress than we need to. Before just going into a snapshot of what New Mexico's emissions look like and might look like under a variety of reduction scenarios, I'll quickly note that these scenarios that I'm displaying here don't include the critical role of oil and gas. This is for energy end-use consumption in New Mexico, and I do that not because I want to underemphasize the role of oil and gas in New Mexico. It's obviously hugely important, but to note because of the uncertainty of the oil and gas, certainly uncertainty in today's economy, but also uncertainty around just the range of emissions. We know that unreported emissions and fugitive emissions are very high in the oil and gas sectors. And so what I raise here is that I think that means additional caution should be made in the other sectors, and that we should be more ambitious in reductions in those sectors, even as we also work to cut emissions in the oil and gas sector.
You know what? I can only see the slide saying April 2020.
Yeah, I haven't jumped
Okay.
into the slides yet. No worries.
Sorry.
I'm going to jump into those and move through them relatively quickly. Those are just to provide a snapshot of a couple of scenarios. So, I'll just, last thing to say on the oil and gas here is that I think New Mexico has, as part of the Permian Basin, we will continue to see oil and gas production. Obviously, oil and gas production is massively down now during this COVID crisis and with low oil prices. What we've seen over the last decades is a boom and bust of the oil and gas sector, and I think we'll continue to see that boom and bust as long as there's a global demand for oil. I think what we can best demonstrate here in New Mexico is that we can power our own economy with 100% clean energy and provide both the technologies to send out to the rest of the world as well as the policies to replicate. So the policies here, I think, are meaningful in showing how we might do that in decarbonizing the rest of the sector at a rapid pace. So here I'll just, again, walk quickly through a couple of scenarios. The first is a scenario based on reducing emissions by 47% by 2030, which would meet the governor's current goal in her executive order from last year. And the second is 60%, which I think is probably appropriate given the uncertainty I mentioned in the oil and gas and the need and opportunity to go faster. So here, I'll just note the first sector, the first scenario, and these are just sort of roughly what we think would be needed to meet the emissions reductions for 47% reductions across the economy outside of oil and gas. So we'd have to implement our 50% standard, retire Escalante and San Juan as have been announced, increase electrification of the bus fleet, and maintain at least federal standards on the fuel economy, which are obviously being withdrawn by the Trump administration. In buildings, we'd have to achieve at least 1% energy improvement in buildings and increase electrification in buildings by about, 10% of natural gas residential buildings and 8% of commercial buildings electrified by 2030. All of that is quite modest, and I think we can actually do better. But if we were to do that, you'll see very significant emissions reductions in the electric sector are underway because of the policies on the books. Much more modest emissions reductions in transportation. And this scenario actually assumes industrial emissions, again, outside of oil and gas, increase over that time. Buildings emissions reduce very modestly. Another example here of potential scenario to get to 60% in all of those major energy consuming sectors of the economy would increase our RPS, or at least our net RPS compliance, to 60% by 2030. Still retire the coal plants, including the Four Corners coal plant, which is not currently slated to retire until 2031 at the soonest. We'd also need to more radically move forward on electrifying transportation. And this is a really big lift. 60% of ZEV zero emission vehicles by 2030 would be nation leading, but I think, as the previous speaker mentioned, could be possible with the level of technological change that we're seeing in that sector. We also need further electrification of the bus fleet, increase efficiency in other vehicles, build out transit infrastructure, and double efficiency in buildings to 2%, as well as much more significant electrification in buildings, which I think would also bring very significant economic benefits. So here you'll see just that scenario. Again, even more significant reduction in the electricity sector, further reductions in the transportation, still assuming increased emissions in the industrial sector, largely because that sector is just harder to model. And so we've left it out here. And so we're assuming sort of a worst case scenario, and even further reductions in buildings because of the electrification that I mentioned and energy efficiency. Now, I think all of that is possible with the simple policy that I mentioned, by basically simply requiring that we meet those limits, giving the agencies the authority to meet them, and then requiring them to build the tools and specific policies, including electrification and energy efficiency, that we'll need to meet those targets. So with that, I'll pause and ask for questions, and if there are time now, or move on to other presenters if we're going to wait for questions until the end.
Yeah, we're going to wait for questions until the end. And if anyone has some questions, please send them via email to ajenks@nmsu.edu. And then we'll filter through them. So next, there we go, there it is. Next, we'll go to Ying, who is from YUCCA, Youth United for Climate Crisis Action. So Bianca, are you able to share the presentation? And Ying, take it away. You're on mute, Ying.
I think we can hear you now. Yeah, she's muted.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes, now we can hear you.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. My name is Yang, and I'm here from YUCCA, Youth United for Climate Crisis Action, which is a youth-led or project of social and environmental justice organization, EarthCare. I'm sorry, I'm really nervous. I'm not gonna lie.
You're doing great. Thanks for being here.
So I was just working on this painting a while back, and I felt like it was very interesting to add it to the conversation because it's environment. My name is Yang. I am from Farmington, New Mexico. Thank you so much for having us. We are proud to be a part of this important event to discuss a path to solve the climate crisis by 2030. Before we begin any public address at YUCCA, we always acknowledge that no matter where we are on Indigenous land. We always give thanks to the Indigenous hosts of the places we call home, and acknowledge that colonialization is an underlying cause of the environmental destruction and disconnection with our Mother Earth that we must address. Today, I am calling in from my homeland, Dineta. I want to acknowledge my Indigenous leaders and elders in my nation that is struggling under the weight of the current pandemic and the current climate crisis. And yet our people carry so much knowledge that it is crucial at this time for the healing of our earth and the healing of all peoples. So I want to take a moment to acknowledge and thank my people for being the original caretakers of the land of New Mexico and for stewarding this place for generations. I invite you all to take a moment to silently give your thanks to Indigenous people where you live. And if you don't know the Indigenous peoples of your area, I invite you to do research and get connected. To stand in solidarity, because Indigenous struggles are struggles to protect the land, air, and water. And we cannot have a climate movement that is not related in Indigenous rights and social justice. So let's just take a moment to honor our Indigenous relatives. I am Yang, a Diné youth from Farmington, New Mexico. I attend New Mexico School for the Arts as a visual artist, and I am a first-generation student to graduate in my family. I will be graduating from high school in June. It is hard for me to be graduating during this pandemic, as I was really looking forward to being the first member of my family to walk across that stage and be handed my diploma. I know that it is a real sadness and loss that many seniors across the state are experiencing. And I just want to say to the class of 2020, everywhere, especially as first generation graduates, I see you and I acknowledge all your hard work and efforts that you put in these last few years. And I share your heartache with you as the one who was the first person in my family to be receiving this honor. And I am also one of 11 steering committee members of Youth United for Climate Crisis Action, which consists of youth from diverse background in northern New Mexico. Here's a picture of me sharing a piece of art called Don't Trust the Black Snake, which was featured in an art show that YUCCA put on last fall as part of the climate strike events that we plan and put together. My people have long prophesized about the black snake and how it threatened our future, specifically the 7th generation. The black snake represents our reliance on oil and other fossil fuels. It represents extraction. the taking from and raping of our Mother Earth for money without regard for the harm being caused. My people have prophesied about the black snake and that our generation, specifically my generation, the seventh, will have a choice to succumb the black snake or to defeat it. And I am here today speaking to you all, my fellow youth, fellow members of the prophesized generation, because together we will defeat the black snake and end our addiction to fossil fuels. I know this because I've had the honor of organizing my peers up in Santa Fe, and I see that our generation is a powerful force for change. We founded YUCCA last summer in order to organize a youth-led climate justice movement here in northern New Mexico and demand immediate action on the climate crisis. Our first big action was on September 12th, 9/20 climate strike, when we organized in response to the international call, and which was a campaign kickoff for our campaign to pressure political leaders at the state level to acknowledge the climate emergency and take action. As we know, in the last year, millions of people have ignited a worldwide movement for immediate action on the climate crisis. Thousands of youth participated in the event across the state. Over 10,000 youth took part. And we were part of making history. The day that more than 7.5 million youth took to the streets around the world. It was amazing. So we had an extremely powerful kickoff to a campaign that hasn't stopped yet. It needs to grow even more powerful over the next year. So I'm here today to tell you about the campaign and let you know what's next. We are striking again.
We lost your sound. Did you get unplugged or something?
Yang, we can't hear you.
Can you guys hear me now?
Yeah, now we can.
Okay.
If you could speak up a little bit. You're doing good though.
All right. Well, for the last 9 months, we've been leading a campaign to call on the governor and other elected officials in New Mexico to declare a climate emergency and take steps to rapidly reduce our emissions and transition our economy away from its dependence on fossil fuels. See, the state of New Mexico has a climate plan, but it doesn't solve the climate crisis by 2030. And it doesn't even set that as a target. Our partners at the research group called Oil Change International did a study and found that if we allow all of the oil and gas reservoirs in New Mexico to be burned, New Mexico's carbon
So we might be having internet connections issues on her side, but keep going. Go ahead.
Is everything okay now? Or am I?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. The problem is that we are so dependent on oil and gas that we currently have an all-above energy strategy, which means that no real action is being taken to reduce oil gas extraction in our state or to transition our economy at the speed we need to. So as young people, we've been organizing to build a movement for a just transition. We developed a climate emergency policy platform. We called on our governor and state leaderships to, number one, declare a climate emergency, acknowledge the depth and breadth of the crisis, listen to the science and start with the right premise. That, according to the world's leading scientists, we have 10, maybe 12 years to fundamentally rewire and decarbonize our global economy in order to avoid catastrophic runaway climate change. Because when you face the science and the research we will hear today, There's no way to call this anything but an emergency. Number 2, commission a study and plan to transition our economy away from fossil fuel dependence. Model other revenue streams to replace nearly half of our state's annual budget.
We're
1,000 renewables by 2030. Might as well do 1,000% renewables by 2030. As a plan is being, and number 4, as the plan is being developed, we must place a moratorium on fracking. That means no new wells. This is necessary if we are going to be able to achieve the carbon neutrality goals scientists say we must achieve. We must keep remaining fossil fuels in the ground. And we demanded that political leaders pass community-driven climate solutions like community solar. That way, our communities throughout the state that are ready to pursue aggressive climate goals can immediately transition away from coal and gas and nuclear to renewables. And every single community throughout our state should have access to the costs and academic development benefits of solar. This is our climate plan, developed by us, young people, informed by our movement elders. We demanded and we're demanding now immediate actions to save our lives and futures. So our campaign has been about building public pressure to force our elected officials to do the right thing on climate. We've written letters to our leaders. We've met with officials. We've given public hearing comment. We've given public comment during hearings. And we've done creative direct actions like this one. On the first day of the 2020 legislature, we did a performance where our youth were led by politicians in suit to demand change on the climate. We were led by politicians in suit to the climate change guillotine. As you can see, the blades were suspended by ropes held by melting ice. Our message to them was that our future is in their hands and they need to take immediate action. We even did an action where we sat in the governor's office and got arrested. All of these actions have been to show that climate action is not something we can just kick down the road. We cannot settle for increment changes. We need to take the threat serious and recognize that it is here and now, not off in the distant future. Setting goals for 2045 is not good enough. I want to share my story of why this work is so personal for me and why it is not just about abstract policies and decisions made by higher ups. I'm here today as a spokesperson and representative of my indigenous people in the Four Corners region, where our lands have been sacrificed for coal and uranium for decades. I know intimately about the cost of extraction. I want to tell you about how my people and I have been affected by the desecration of land for profit, which started long before I was born. Dineta, my homeland, was designed an energy sacrifice zone by the Nixon administration in 1973. And since then, my community has experienced the health and environmental impacts from hundreds of uranium mines, 4 coal plants, and hundreds of fracking wells. Here's a map of all the oil and gas development in my area. This is the San Juan generating station, one of the oldest and dirtiest coal plants in the country, just a few miles away from my house. You can also see the coal mine here and the wounds of our Mother Earth's body. Depending on where you live in New Mexico, it is quite likely that some of the power you are using to turn on your lights and run your computers comes from this plant that is in my homeland. And this is the Four Corners coal plant, also right near my house. The power from this plant also serves much of New Mexico. So when you charge your phone, this is where your power is coming from. Over generations, my people have been systematically targeted as an unsafe and unjust economic development has been pursued for the extraction of resources. Though I grew up in the shadow of two coal plants, literally within 10 miles of one another, both looming over my hometown of Farmington, I didn't really understand what was being done to the land, the air, and the water, and my people, until one day. I went back to Farmington for the weekend, and my family usually crosses the river to get into town. This was as normal as always, but this day would change me. This day made history. In 2015, a dark cloud of chemical pollution left the Gold King mines and spilled into the San Juan River, a river I had grown up playing in. I saw this beloved river turned into mustard yellow because of our human carelessness, and greed. The waters I used to swim in are no longer safe to dip your toes in, let alone grow agricultural crops and feed your livestock. This risky approach of extraction and consumption powers our cities and allows us to have all these luxuries. But back home on my reservation homelands, it means living beside oil and gas barrels, fracking wells. We have plenty of asthma, cancer, lung disease, but we don't have
I think we lost.
the nation. But instead of having, can you guys hear me? I'm having a lot of difficulties with this.
Doing okay. We can hear you. If you don't have the video and just have audio, maybe you'll have a little more bandwidth.
Okay, let me try that. Right now, more than ever, we see the false promise of the fossil fuel economy. Communities like mine have been powering the nation, but instead of having abundant resources from the wealth extracted from our lands, we are poor. We live in poverty every day. Thousands of residents, including myself, live off the grid without electricity, without drinkable water, no secure food supply. In this time of crisis with the pandemic, people in my community don't even have running water to properly wash our hands. And so the virus has spread more quickly in the Navajo Nation than in New Mexico or Arizona. We have a disproportionate number of cases, and we have more deaths from the coronavirus than all of New Mexico. The deaths of our community members from this virus are not related to the impacts of energy of our community. With so much asthma, lung disease, heart disease, and other pre-existing conditions from the pollution of our fossil fuel industry, our community is very vulnerable. That on top of the lack of food supplies and the generational poverty that exists because of colonization and extraction, means that this is a serious crisis for our people. Our governor in New Mexico has said that tribes are being left behind by the federal government. And it is good that our members of Congress, like Senator Udall, are pointing out the injustice. But we need to recognize that the injustice is not starting with the pandemic. The pandemic is showing us a picture of the unjust world we have been creating. The pre-existing health conditions we are carrying because of our toxic ways. The pandemic is revealing the inequality and the ugliness of our current economic model. The priorities of our economy are all backwards. Instead of investing in resilient, sustainable, and health, Our state budget has been built for the practice of poisoning our waters, lands, and lungs. We have built dependency on fossil fuel extraction, even though it is literally trying to kill us. Literally killing us. Scientists have told us that we have 10 years to reverse, to wake up and end our addiction. This is the timeline. Any policy proposals that do not strive towards carbon neutrality by 2030 are irresponsible. Mother Earth is giving us a jump start and a major wake-up call. This virus has brought our oil and gas industries to its knees, and we need to rise to the challenge and make this transition that is long overdue. According to a report released by New Mexico's Finance Committee Chair, our state budget is in big trouble. That's because right now, 40% of our state's budget comes from oil and gas revenues. We see how vulnerable that makes us. So our immediate response at YUCCA has been to organize a mutual aid network, helping our community in northern New Mexico and on Navajo nations, sharing resources and to get critical resources like food, wood, water, and financial assistance. And right now, that's where most of our time and attention is going. But we are also looking at the ways we need to change the structure to protect against further hardship. So in terms of proposing one bold policy we need to make right now, we need to make a transition our state's economy off of fossil fuel dependence and invest that money that is spent to help businesses and labor right now and green business and jobs that promote health and well-being and vital services in a sustainable way, not businesses that threaten our communities. There should be no bailout for the oil industry and no cutting to protect our health. We are calling for a just transition study and a fund for the rebuilding of our economy as a green economy. We need a plan to develop the green industry, to clean up the mess we've made, build out our healthcare infrastructure, especially in rural communities like mine, and invest in sustainable technology, like community solar. That makes our community safer and more self-reliant in times of crisis. As our federal government passes relief packages with hundreds of millions of economic assistance for businesses, we need to make sure those public dollars go into building a green economy and a just economy. Indigenous communities, communities of color.
Sorry to interrupt. Allison, I just got a text from Tom Udall. He doesn't have long to be in this meeting, so if we can ask to, I don't know how you want to go through it, Allison.
The state of New Mexico. That includes a plan to transition our. It is this wrong. Can you guys hear me? Hello?
Yeah,
Can you guys-
we can hear you.
Okay, I'm gonna just start that again.
Okay.
For the miscommunication. We have an enormous opportunity to build our economy in a way that works for everyone. Let's design economic recovery to protect the people, the land, the waters, and the climate. We are demanding a green economic recovery for the state of New Mexico that includes a plan to transition our state's economy off of fossil fuel revenue and that is created in consultation with grassroots, frontline, and indigenous communities. And at the national level, we want to see a green economic recovery through a Green New Deal. Our next big action will be on April 22nd. It's the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. And we want to use the opportunity to support young people like you from all over the state to get organized to transform our economy so that when we recover from the coronavirus and solve the climate crisis, we are going to have a giant web-based event. We'd love for you to join us. We need young people who see that the world right now is not fair, just, or sustainable. We need young people who are willing to join together to fight for a better future. Please sign up at our website.
Beautiful. Thank you very much. So Tom Udall is calling in now. So we're going to go to him really quick, and then we'll be back over to our final speaker, Abraham Ellis from Sandia National Labs. And again, if you have any questions, please email them into ajenks@nmsu.edu, and hopefully we can get to them, but we're running low. So I'll turn it over to Tom Udall.
Thank you. Can all of you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Good. Thank you very much. Thank you for those presentations, and I know that Abraham is going next, and I have one of my staff on the call that will brief me on what Abraham says and on the questions too. But I just wanted to just briefly just thank you so much for coming together today to work on solutions to climate change. Climate change is impacting life across the world, and we're in the bullseye here in New Mexico. I heard Noah's powerful words, Yang's powerful words, very moving about the Navajo Nation, and we're feeling it here in New Mexico. In the first 50 years since Earth Day began, we had plenty of success fighting for the environment. And I think the environmental movement is as strong as it's ever been. But right now we're dealing with the spiraling effects of global warming and the Trump administration's complete disregard for environmental protection. I've worked hard in the Senate on these issues, and I'm looking forward to continuing to work with all of you to do more. And I think you hit the right tone today when you said this should be an emergency. We need a climate emergency. 1,100 scientists have written in and called it a climate emergency. And all of us, I think, are speaking out and saying we've got to grow renewable energy. We've got to put a price on carbon. We've got to reduce the consumption of fossil fuels, use the tax code to incentivize renewable energy. That is what we should be doing, and we should be doing it like it's in an emergency. And I just so applaud the young people for what you're doing and leading this get-together on this day. You've always led the way in creating a better, cleaner planet, and today's event is a part of that. Your youth activism inspires me. It's why I signed on to the Green New Deal. Your energy is going to create the change we need. And right now we're living through an unprecedented time, so it means even more that you're taking the time to focus on the environment. Together, we can work toward a healthier, more sustainable future. And now I turn it back to David, your moderator, and thank you so much for letting me participate. Cheers, take care, bye-bye.
Thank you for being here. So we'll go over to Abraham, sorry. We'll go over to Abraham from Sandia Labs next. Abraham, are you able to share your screen and your PowerPoint? Hello. We can see you, can't hear you.
Yeah, Abraham, you might have to activate your microphone. There's a little icon at the bottom left corner. You might have to say join audio. Yeah, we can't hear you. You have to activate your microphone.
Come on, Abe, you're an NMSU graduate.
Yeah, so on the bottom left, Abraham, there's an icon where it says, the little icon that has a microphone. You have to activate it. You click on it and it's join audio with computer, I believe. There you go, you're connecting now. Okay, now go ahead and unmute yourself. Here, I'll go ahead and do it for you. Okay, go ahead and talk.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can now.
Beautiful, thank you.
Okay, very good. Well, good afternoon, everybody. It is Tuesday evening here in Washington, D.C., and I want to wish all of you the best through this crisis that we are going through right now. It's hard to say that I'm enjoying a quiet time at home. I'm still working quite busily here, providing some support currently to the U.S. Department of Energy on questions related to technology that are very much germane to this conversation of how to solve this climate challenge. I want to start by saying thank you, Allison, and the team that put this event together, and I really hope that it gets disseminated pretty widely. Let me share a few of my thoughts here that have to do with what you see here on the screen. I would like to think about this challenge from a technology point of view and see what the opportunities and the challenges that we have in front of us are, what are the main ones, and how can New Mexico take advantage of this unique moment in time, this unique opportunity and challenge to really establish itself, not just as a state that was able to do its part to solve climate change, as the title of this event talks about, but also leave an enduring legacy of that effort in this state in terms of a science and technology base that we can use to solve problems going forward. So I'd like to make sure we all understand here that climate and what we need to solve it goes well beyond energy, but energy is a big part of that. Depending on sort of how you count it, electricity generation accounts for something like a third or a quarter of the greenhouse gases that are emitted. So it is an important part of the battle against climate change. Here in the US, of course, we've had a history of addressing that problem, unfortunately, on a state-by-state basis. And there's no difference in the case of New Mexico. It really does take state leadership at this time to make some progress in these areas, at least with respect to the clean technologies. Energy, of course, is a complex landscape, and there's other, as the other speakers talked about, other aspects of energy, including the fossil fuels and all of that, which are intertwined with the economy in very complex ways. But for today's discussion, I would like to read renewable energy here and what are the opportunities for New Mexico and what we can do about this particular challenge. I wanted to tell you a little bit about myself, not for anything other than to convey a little bit of perspective on this challenge. I was born and raised in Panama. You can see the picture there on the left. That's me at first grade. I didn't know much about energy at the time, but what I did know is we didn't really have electricity in the town that I grew up in the mountains. Somehow that sort of colored my perspective about education and what I wanted to do when I grew up. And so the picture there on the top is of me doing some work in rural development in Latin America using solar and wind back in the mid-90s, late 90s. What I wanted to tell you about that is that back then, solar and wind power really made a lot of sense for applications that were not connected to the grid because of their cost profile. It was really not envisioned that it would happen so fast that within a decade of that time, picture over in the lower right, we would have a renaissance of wind power in New Mexico, very closely followed now by major deployments of solar PV, and on goes the story. And so what we're talking about here changes that in the grand scheme of things happen very fast, and that's exactly the type of solutions that we're looking for. Type of technology deploy fast that are not just good in terms of their cost profile now, but have the potential to evolve fast, relatively fast, because they themselves, the deployment of these technologies will actually bring to the forefront technical challenges that also need to be solved so that we can keep this phase or this pace of deployment going into the future. Noah earlier talked about the New Mexico Energy Transition Act, but I wanted to talk a little bit about that. I just noticed a typo on screen here is 2019 when it was enacted. But this Energy Transition Act really does put New Mexico as a leader among the states in clean energy goals. And this is very suitable for New Mexico, as we'll see later. We should build on that, and that's really the question. I think the answer to the first question is yes, we are well positioned to meet this challenge, but there are also multiple opportunities to multiply these benefits, and that's what I want to highlight going forward. The 50% by 2030 that was mentioned before is just one of the targets in the legislation. It goes on to say that by 2040, we need to be at 80% and then 100% by 2045. This is the type of policies that make a lot of sense because they target not just the ability to do something about climate change, but it's done in such a way that we also think about what it means for New Mexico in terms of reduced energy bills for consumers going forward, and also in terms of opportunities for economic development. I mentioned before, and this is no news to anybody, but I just wanted to let you know again that it just makes a ton of sense for New Mexico to tackle this challenge from a renewable energy point of view, seeing as how we have some of the best wind potential in the world in New Mexico, and also some of the best solar potential in the world right here in New Mexico. Turns out that we also have some of the richest potential when it comes to geothermal energy. Sometimes that type of technology and what it means for our future gets a bit forgotten, but there's a place for all of it, and that's part of the story that I wanted to share with this, is that solving this, this complex challenge also requires some complex solutions, and that's what we need to be after. So a bit of a preview, again, something that you've already seen, but we're going to see a lot more, is continued deployment of wind and solar generation in the state. I mentioned earlier that I've spent a little bit of time working on this. I've had the opportunity to work on this from a technology standpoint. One of the things that we realized from a perspective of an engineer working in this space is that the technology itself is on a fairly steep progression with respect to technology development. So wind power plants and solar power plants have come a long way in a very short period of time. It used to be that those power plants were not considered to be the equivalent of conventional generation with respect to their capabilities to maintain a grid that works reliably and then is able to keep the lights on 24/7. But those are all news. This technology now, coupled with other things like energy storage and as a mix of a portfolio of renewable and non-renewable resources, can easily provide the levels of reliability or even better reliability than conventional generation can provide. You know, and that's the type of technology that we'd like to incentivize going forward. There are, of course, a number of technical challenges I mentioned before that need to be addressed, even as New Mexico itself is just a microcosm of the entire battle against climate change evolves here in the state. We'll have to encounter and also solve, obviously, some significant technical challenges. I mentioned one already is, you know, how do we make sure that the grid that we have works with renewable energy? That requires us to make optimal use of the infrastructure that we already have deployed on the grid. And so that requires us to rethink how we turn on and off generation, how do we ramp it up and down, and how do we meet demand on a second-by-second basis? How do we do so economically? How do we do so in such a way that the system is not fragile, it's not, you know, that can be relied upon even as as Mother Nature or other intentional threats evolve on the grid. So this is possible to do with renewable energy, but it does change the way in which we operate the system that we have. There's also going to be a need for increased flexibility for future needs of the grid. Of course, as you add more renewable energy to the system, those tend to be more variable renewable generation. You have them when you have them. They tend to vary to some extent, although less so on a wide geographical basis. But nonetheless, you do need to have the ability for the other parts of the grid, including the demand, to be able to follow along these changes. And that is very possible to do by tapping not just our ability to add storage to the grid, but also our ability to tap into demand itself, electrical demand itself, as a source of flexibility for the grid. And lastly, we need to think about the fact that this infrastructure eventually needs to be expanded in some strategic ways in order to accommodate more renewable energy on the grid. Part of that is the need to have a way for these areas that have large scale renewable potential to be tapped and to have the ability to take that generation and transmit it, not just for the citizens of New Mexico, but for other places where there are markets for electricity throughout the Southwest. So we can't really forget that because they go hand in hand. If we really wanted to have tons and tons of renewable deployment in the state, we have to think about ways to accommodate those on the grid, and transmission is part of that answer. One of the technologies that has been labeled a game changer when it comes to our ability to accommodate more renewable energy is what you see here on the screen, is energy storage. I'm really excited about that because we're really in the beginning of what could be a technology that can be deployed at large scale on the grid. Right now, it's too expensive to put in energy storage in a very large scale everywhere on the grid. But more and more, we're seeing that when you couple them with solar or wind projects, depending on where you are and what the business models are, you can actually make it pencil out from an economic standpoint. What I'm really excited about is the possibility for this technology to develop in such a way that the trends for lower cost and higher reliability, higher longevity are sustained over time, such that in something like 10 years time, which is what we have between now and 2030, we're going to see a completely different equation and our ability to think of energy storage as part of the solution in a ubiquitous manner. And that's something that national laboratories in New Mexico, including, and also the Department of Energy, is working very hard on. And it is an opportunity that we have as a country as well to position ourselves as a technology leader going forward, because it's really not easy to make this type of technology work at a very, very large scale with the safety, the performance, and the cost that we really require at this time. So years are going to be critical for these type of technologies, and we're very excited to be in a position to make a contribution here. I wanted to, in the spirit of providing kind of a challenge here for New Mexico, I wanted to say that in addition to the very clear and aggressive policy goals that we have been able to set for ourselves in New Mexico, something that goes along with that we can aspire to is really to leave that legacy of science and technology associated with clean energy technologies for the state of New Mexico. And I think that a good way to do that is to challenge the vast resources that we have in New Mexico in terms of science and technology, such as laboratories, the schools, the universities, the state resources, our congressional delegations, et cetera. To think about what can be done in a place where we have already made a commitment to reach a very high deployment of renewable energy. Can we close the deal, so to say, and try to figure out ways to make all of that effort count, not just for achieving those goals, but also leaving, as I said before, a way, or basically finding solutions for some of these very difficult technical challenges that not just New Mexico, but everybody else needs to grapple with. So among those challenges that we can do or incorporate into this national showcase that could be deployed in New Mexico, I have a few here for us to think about. One is that we could become a leader in distributed energy resources that are renewable based and are distributed here. So one of the technologies that I'm very excited about is this idea of renewable based resilient microgrids. So we need to think about ways for these renewable resources to be able to stay connected to the loads, especially critical loads in a situation where you might have some trouble with the grid. For example, critical loads like hospitals and things like that need to be able to function no matter what. So right now, the type of renewable systems that we're putting onto the grid aren't necessarily designed or able to actually maintain power supply to the loads in the case of a grid outage. And I think, going forward, energy resilience is an important part of these values that we need to look for when we think about a more progressive, high-performing grid. And so that can be done at various scales. It can be done at a house scale. It can also be done at a larger building scale or a campus scale, such as universities or places like that. But the sky is the limit with respect to these kinds of nested, self-sustaining energy systems in places where we really need it, where a little bit more effort and perhaps more investment is necessary for resiliency purposes. And so that's one of those items that we could include in the showcase. Another one could be a way for the state of New Mexico to lead the way in tapping system flexibility in all of its forms. I already mentioned that I'm very excited about the idea of energy storage deployed at a very large scale in a cost-effective manner, but there are other things that we can do to be able to extract the same type of flexibility or equivalent type of flexibility by requesting in various ways that type of flexibility from the load itself. And so when we need the additional load on the system because we have an excess generation, we need to have ways to flexibly allocate that either for export somewhere, we need to put them on energy storage, or we perhaps have ways to flexibly utilize that energy domestically. Same thing happens when we have a deficiency in generation, or maybe prices are a little bit higher. Can we make use of demand flexibility to do a little bit of a better job in terms of balancing the system? These are things that are known, but to be able to demonstrate that at scale in a system the size of, say, New Mexico, in a way that is cost effective and sustainable, I think we still have a lot of work to do, and that can also be part of the showcase going forward. Obviously, we have the opportunity, and we will have to do this, is to deploy very large-scale wind and solar. I mentioned before that one of the challenges to doing this in the thousands of megawatt, which is what we will need going forward, is we need to really figure out this question of transmission. This is not something that New Mexico can do by itself. This really does require a regional effort to be able to strengthen and expand to the extent necessary the transmission infrastructure in this area, because the ability to generate enough power from renewable energy in New Mexico to some extent is predicated on our ability to export the excess to other markets throughout the Southwest. And right now we don't really have sufficient transmission to be able to do that at the scale that we need, in the 15, 20 years time frame. So that needs to be part of the equation. And lastly, and this has been mentioned before, is we have an opportunity here to also think about how to make an impact from a climate change standpoint in other sectors of the economy that also have a really high footprint, for example, transportation. So in the case of New Mexico, part of this showcase could be a way to integrate electric fast charging or electric transportation into the equation. I think we can do all of this as part of this large-scale broad-based showcase in New Mexico. And the reason I wanted to give you a list instead of a single zinger here is because the solution, as I mentioned before, to this very complex challenge has to be, even from a technology standpoint, sophisticated. And so we can't do any one of these things and hope to solve the challenge. I think it requires for us to think about all the ways from a technology standpoint that we need to attack this problem. I'll leave you with this slide that basically repeats what I just said before. I think that's one way to close the deal. We talked about a little bit of policy here. We talked about the leadership the state had with respect to the clean energy generation. But I really, what I want to challenge us to do here is to think about ways to make out of our state a leader in green energy technologies. We can do it. We can leverage our vast amounts of renewable energy resources that we have in the state, principally wind and solar. We also have a very large world-class science and technology base in the state, our universities, our national laboratories that we can use. We need to continue to march forward, keeping in mind that there are other parts that are non-technology that are part of the equation. You know what those are. And we've talked about that before. Education and workforce, economic development needs to go hand in hand. This is not a problem that is for one part of society to solve. We need a true public-private partnership. Here, we do want the companies, the utilities, the technology companies to do their part, but we also have to do our part also as the public in this. And lastly, I wanted to highlight exactly what the previous speaker talked about, is that there's also a social justice aspect to these challenges, and we need to keep that in mind as we search for solutions. With that, I turn it back to you.
Thank you. So again, you guys are sending in a lot of questions. Keep them coming. We only have about 15 minutes left though, so not sure if we can get through all of them. Send them over to their agents at nmsu.edu, and I will turn it over to Dave Dubois, who's our state climatologist, to pick his favorite one, maybe two questions. Dave, you're on mute. I can unmute you if you want. And also all this video will be available on solveclimateby2030.org along with sustainability.nmsu.edu if you want to go back or anything like that.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Allison. And just thanks to Noah, Yang, and Abraham for their wonderful messages. We really appreciate them here. This is Dave Dubois, the state climatologist for New Mexico, in my home office in Las Cruces. And I just want to, while we get some more questions in from Allison, she was going to send them to me. I got one question for the panelists. So that's basically, so how can New Mexico rural counties get involved in the climate change initiatives that seem to be mostly originating in the populous cities? So what can the, so a lot of the, maybe a lot of the people listening are in rural areas. So how can they get, participate?
This is Noah. I'll jump in quickly, and I'm sure the other folks can add on. First of all, I mean, everybody can and should get involved in the political process. Our political leaders need to know that climate change is a top priority issue and it's not going away. There's urgency to act. So whether you're from a rural part of the state or an urban part of the state, I'd say we actually have climate champions elected from both rural and urban parts of New Mexico. We're one of the, I'd say, too few states in the country where that's the case, but here we do have climate champions from different parts of the state, both rural and urban. So I think there are opportunities to get involved in the political process. Secondly, you know, I think as the last speaker, Abraham, mentioned, New Mexico is on the cusp of becoming a renewable energy production giant, which both for consumption here in New Mexico as well as across the West in particular. And so I really hope that folks in rural parts of the state will be able to be involved in some way in the renewable energy economy. And lastly, you know, many of the solutions that we've talked about are available to people in every part of the state, and I think will increasingly be available to everybody, folks in every part of the state. So thinking about how you can reduce emissions yourselves, but also support your community to do that, support community scaled renewable energy generation, transportation electrification opportunities, which are with ranges on those vehicles increasing, I think a viable solution for all parts of our state, and also local jurisdiction actions on reducing emissions, whether it's rural or urban. So I really think that's something we all can do from every part of the state.
Hi, this is John Wiles. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, John.
Those people in rural areas, if you have sufficient funds, consider personal involvement in climate change by upgrading the insulation on your house, the efficiency of your house, possibly adding photovoltaic power systems, even with energy storage, which will help the grid and provide additional resiliency and sustainability for the state. And if you're really in a position to buy an electric vehicle, do so. So these are personal commitments that you can make to help address climate change, in addition to working the political end of the spectrum with your various lawmakers.
Thank you, John. Does one of our speakers, Abraham or Yang, have anything additional that they would like to add on that question? Not all at once now.
I think Yanni is trying to speak, but her microphone's not working.
Oh,
Can you guys hear me?
Yes, now we can hear you.
Maybe I'll add something here. If that's okay, can you hear me?
yeah, we can hear you. Yang was also starting.
Okay,
as
great.
well.
I'll just give a shout out from a technology perspective to the role of the rural sector here. It turns out that some of the challenges associated with the deployment of renewable energy on the grid tend to be more acute in places that have a relatively large amount of renewable deployment with respect to their load. And so what we have seen here, working from the perspective of the National Laboratory and the Department of Energy, is that many of the rural utilities in the United States are facing some of the challenges that we will have to address as we try to deal with those problems for the larger grids that are, feed some of these larger cities and states. Let me just give you one example here. There's a utility in rural Alaska that we are working with currently that has a project to try to showcase how you can combine different kinds of technologies at grid scale. So we're talking lots of batteries, lots of electric vehicles, high-end controls with high-speed communications and things like that, in addition to hydro and solar and these kinds of resources, and make it all work, not just at a house level, but from a utility standpoint, and go all out with these technologies and achieve anywhere close to 100% renewables. And it turns out that the lessons learned from these communities that happen to be rural communities are the ones that we're looking at for guidance as we try to solve this for very large grids. So there's a very large role to play there, even by some of these utilities in rural areas.
I think Yanni was going to say something. Yeah, we can't hear you again. Try it. There you go. Now we can hear you.
I'm
There you
having
go.
so
Perfect.
much microphone difficulty. So this is a question that I've often come across. From the reservation, I used to go to school at Saturday. So for me, it was like transitioning to the reservation and the urban cities. And so for me, the big question was, how do I get involved in climate change? And so I found out the first thing to do to educate yourself. Educate yourself and understand where you stand in this earth. I think that was one reflection that really helped me out as an individual into this advocating field, was that I needed to understand what I was fighting for and why I was fighting for it. And it kept going back to the same motive, is to protect Mother Earth and the people. And so my big advice is to educate yourself and then mobilize efforts to get other community members into helping out, into making organizing and being an organization that can help. Just starting with little things like maybe planting trees, starting a little farm, cleaning up areas that are trashed, because that's like the main focus that I that I personally want to get more involved in is cleaning up the earth, because like I've seen corporations just come in the reservation lands and destroy it and leave and get money off of that. But I why I continue to fight. So educate, mobilize, organize, and take little steps, because you can't save the world today, but if we work together, we will save the day one day.
Thank you for being here. Dave, do you have one more question? I know we're wrapping it up, so you're on mute.
Thank you. Thanks for giving it. We got a few more questions here. Let's see if we can get at least one or two of them before we have to end this. First one was, with the no climate change people in the New Mexico legislature, how do we get laws passed to allow the New Mexico administration to exercise control over the various organizations that affect greenhouse gas emissions?
Dave, I'm not sure I understood that. Could you restate that for us?
I think what we're trying to get at is, so how do we encourage the passage of more laws? There's a lot of talk about methane reductions, which is great, but I think there likely going to be more things that need to be on the table other than the oil and gas. I think that's a great start, but I think there's other sectors, like you showed earlier, about greenhouse gas emissions in New Mexico. So how do we get those on the table to be talked about? And it's got to, I think they're asking about the legislative administrative actions.
Sure. Well, I'll be very brief and pass it on to the other folks, since I think I've already said my piece on that, which is get involved in the political process. Let your legislator know that you're interested in this, that you care about it, that's an issue for rural New Mexico, for urban New Mexico, for people from every part of the state. Vote for the primary candidate and the general election candidate that's going to act on climate change. And then work with local organizations that care about these issues and lend support, and will keep the pressure up between elections, and also to share information with other folks about the opportunities and challenges that we face as a state because of climate change.
Okay. There's several questions on the talking about the infrastructure for EV vehicles, and are we considering the cost, the environmental cost in terms of carbon in the building and infrastructure to maintain single occupancy electric vehicles?
I'll be very brief. I mean, there is a huge role for reducing emissions from reducing vehicle miles traveled, is the fancy name for it, but basically increasing transit and walking and biking. Those are certainly need to be part of the solution, but electric vehicles emit a lot less damaging climate change pollution than do gas powered vehicles. So we need to make that tradition as well. I don't think it's an either or. We need to do both. And while there are, some modest increases from adding the infrastructure, largely our existing electricity infrastructure is underused and can charge vehicles at night. And as we move to more and more renewable energy, it can do that with a cleaner and cleaner fuel mix, and ultimately 100% clean fuel mix. So I think it's a huge opportunity for our state.
I'll just add to that we really need to think about, as we deploy this new infrastructure, such as electric vehicle chargers and things like that, is to seize the opportunities we have to make sure they are an asset to the grid, that they can provide or add additional flexibility when needed, as opposed to simply become another load that we cannot control. So this is why I was saying earlier that, when we embark in a problem like this, the technical solutions are complex, and we need to acknowledge that they are, and they have solutions, right? But they're not simple.
Okay, maybe we can squeeze another question in. So what do you think the panels think about, I know we talked a little bit about in terms of the local energy versus regional, statewide energy, in terms of social justice, kind of like, when we, getting source local food would be better than bringing it in at long ways in terms of the life cycle analysis.
That I'll be very brief with that. I think there's an incredible lesson here to learn. It turns out that the more local you make renewable energy, the less you need in terms of infrastructure to move it around to other places. And so that's a really good place to look, is distributed generation that is close to the load wherever you are, whether in cities or in rural communities. There is also a place for large scale transmission in the equation, because if you go rooftop by rooftop, while we can get far with that, we're not going to get far enough. I think we need to really look at both localized as well as centralized renewable deployment.
I agree. And I'll just note that we've been moving coal power around the Western United States and really all of the United States, very long distances for decades. And now we have an opportunity to use those same transmission lines to move renewable energy from the places where it can be best produced. And New Mexico happens to be one of those places, and bring about significant economic development in doing so. So I think we shouldn't rule out large scale projects, but certainly there is a real advantage both in electric resilience and economic development to doing small scale projects too. And we have room for both. We need both.
I can add one more quick thing. And so if I haven't heard from Yang, in terms of getting, so what can students do now? I know you brought up there, you have a April 22nd action, the climate strike in Mexico, but what other things that can students do to help with this?
We can't hear you, Yang.
Okay.
Oh, now we can.
Yeah,
Okay.
we can hear you.
All right. Well, one thing young people can do, like right now, with or without any technology, is just to do basic reflections. I think that's one thing that, as an individual in this generation, I feel like kids, the youth need to understand that we're in this together. And one thing that they can do immediately, if they really want to start taking action, is join YUCCA and organize and organize and organize. You can also follow us on Instagram at yucca.nm, and we usually push for action during the special session. We get commitments from candidates ahead of the June primary. Vote in the primary, vote in November, and the Mexico legislative session is coming in 2021. And I think that's the most important time to really educate yourselves about the bills going in and out of the session, because those are the ones that are going to be affecting New Mexicans. So just take it step by step. I know it seems like this is impossible. Trust me, I know how it feels. But we need to be stronger than what the politicians are making us feel. I know that YUCCA had struggles to get laws passed, like especially the community solar. We kept showing up to the session, making sure that they heard our voices and made sure that our concerns were addressed, and made sure that that our presence is known and we take back our voices in democracy into the House. So just really believe in yourself. Don't think that you can't do it.
We lost your microphone again, Yang. Can you?
But I really like how passionate you are about saying it, though.
We can't hear you.
Can you guys hear me?
Now we can. Yeah, we lost you for a minute there.
Okay, well, I just wanted to say that anything's possible. Don't let these older generations tell us that it's not possible, because we've proved them wrong up to this point, that we cannot survive and continue to survive off of this economic structure. So there does need to be transition, and I think every single buddy has the power to do it, and it just takes one single person to spark a fire that won't be let out.
Great. Thanks, Yang. Really appreciate that. So I think I'll hand it back to Allison. I think we're about out of time, I think. Is that right?
Yeah. Thank you very much for everyone for being here and all of our wonderful presenters. I know it's a wild and crazy time currently, not just, yeah, everything's strange enough in the air, but thank you very much for being here. And yeah, you'll be able to get this presentation online on Self-Climate by 2030 and sustainability.nmsu.edu. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Allison,
Thanks
and everybody from
virtual.
NSU and everybody for putting this on. Thank you.
Yeah.
Same here. Be safe, everybody.
Thank you. Have a good one. Bye.